Good morning, afternoon, evening, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are, and welcome to the final 1920s lesson of term. I'm Mr. Flint. You can see my email address there on the screen right now, wmrf@kings-school.co.uk. The idea behind today's lesson is just to go over the whole of the decade in brief, essentially. How are we going to sum up the 1920s? How are we going to think about it? What got better? What stayed the same? And what got worse? Got a couple of book recommendations at the end. If you've got any questions about anything in the PowerPoint, you want to learn any more information about any of these points, just get in touch with me, as I said. Okay, let's get into it. So, first of all, in the 1920s, what got better? The improvements of the 1920s were all more or less founded on the economic boom, which is born out of the First World War. If you remember, we did this back at the beginning of the term. The economic boom comes as, at least in part, a result of the United States not being as directly involved with the First World War as many of its competitors, especially in Europe. Germany needed to rebuild, the United Kingdom needed to rebuild, France needed to rebuild. And so these huge empires that have been ruling the world for 150, 200 years, even longer in some cases, were now crumbling, and they had to look after themselves. And so that meant that the United States could jump in. And there were a whole lot of other reasons which we looked at before. The policies of the government resulted in a boom, to an extent resulted in a bust. One could argue the natural resource of the United States, lots and lots of different reasons, but it's all founded on this economic boom, which improves lots of people's lives. Added into that, for women, lots of things got better in the lives of women. They had political representation, they had a different social role to an extent, especially in the cities. This is the growth of the flappers, which is what the image is here, a kind of new societal, cultural role for women, which hadn't really existed before. In terms of culture more generally, this is primarily in the cities, but to an extent elsewhere. You've got a big boom. You've got new kinds of music, in particular jazz music, blues music, which we looked at previously. Think of this is where we look at Robert Johnson and Blind Lemon Jefferson and Louis Armstrong. Great music which comes from the 1920s, which in the 1940s and 50s will develop into kind of rock music, or certainly rock and roll, and then into the 1960s rock music. And that's kind of where all modern music more or less comes from. You can, if not directly, then certainly indirect all modern music back to the simple structure of blues music and jazz music. So music in the 1920s certainly improves. Books, some of the great writing of the United States is born out of the 1920s. F. Scott Fitzgerald, who I've mentioned The Great Gatsby in pretty much every lesson, I'm going to mention it at least twice today. He was kind of the quintessential 1920s author. Ernest Hemingway, this is when he lives in Paris throughout most of the 20s, but he's still an American author who cuts his teeth in the 1920s. Books that characterize the psyche of the United States. This is a word I was explaining in the previous video on the Wall Street crash, which make sure to go and watch it if you haven't done already. The psyche of the United States is certainly defined for a large part by the 1920s. It's also when Hollywood is born as an industry, the idea of movies being an industry, of being a mass cultural product that everyone will consume. That comes from the 1920s. It's when the first talkie movies are made. You don't just have silent images with a pianist accompanying it. You have people talking and acting and singing. This is the first talkie is The Jazz Singer by Al Jolson, which we watched a little clip in the class on minstrels, because he dresses up in blackface in it. Art, which we didn't get into much, but art certainly booms in the 1920s, as does sport, which is what the final image is on the slide. That is, of course, great Bambino, Babe Ruth, the New York Yankees slugger, who kind of characterizes the sport of the 1920s. It's a boom period. It's also in other sports, boxing, we saw Jack Dempsey. It's also when college football is becoming much more of a nationwide product because of radio, because you can follow your team not just from the stadium. It's where the NFL is also born in the late 1920s. So it's an era defined by improvement based on the economic boom, but where cultural and societal roles shift and for some improve. In some ways, however, things very much stay the same in lots of ways. For the poor, for farmers, for miners, which is what the bottom right picture is here, their lives don't really see too much improvement, relatively speaking. In terms of their cultural lives and things that make their lives a bit more enjoyable, then of course they will have access to a lot of the other things that we were just looking at, a lot of the sport, a lot of the music, that kind of thing. But relatively speaking, the gap between the poor and the rich doesn't really close in the 1920s, and in some ways it gets much larger. For minorities, segregation is still a huge problem. The legal separation of people based on the colour of their skin. You would go to a railway station and there would be two waiting rooms. The names, the words above the doors would be white and coloured. Coloured is the name given to minorities during this period. And so if you're not white, even if you're not WASP, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, then to an extent you're coloured. And so segregation is a characteristic part of the 1920s that it had existed before and will go on to exist after the 1920s too. Based on that, segregation is evidence of the intolerance that characterises a lot of the United States. We saw this with things like lives of Native Americans, lives of African Americans and black people, lives of immigrants, Sacco and Vanzetti, who, it was partly for their political beliefs, but still a form of intolerance, but also because they were Italian immigrants who didn't speak much English. So intolerance characterises a lot of the United States, and that intolerance leads to massive divisions in the countryside, in the cities, which is what we saw with John Scopes, who's the guy in the boater hat here and the round glasses, he of the monkey trial, in division between the poor and the rich, which certainly becomes clear with, remember the images of the Hoovervilles from the previous video. Divisions between, as I was just mentioning, with segregation, WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and all of the minorities. And divisions between men and women in particular. Women do have more rights, but it is still very much a society based on a patriarchal structure. What that means is the men are in charge, that families are run with a father in charge, that the governmental system is very similar. You only have your first woman congressman in the United States in the 1920s, and she is an exception, very much. So it's a patriarchal society in which men and women, although in some ways things are getting better with women, they are still divided. So all of these things are things that had existed previous to the 1920s, and things that the United States exited the 1920s and went into the 1930s, still very much experiencing and encountering. But there are some things that it would be pretty easy to argue get a lot worse in the 1920s. First of all, you've got the economic bust, which comes at the end, October of 1929, as the Wall Street crash, and that will go on to characterise certainly the first half of the 1930s. So the boom leads to a bust. You have prohibition underlining everything. There are some very good articles online about how prohibition led to the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, for example, how it led to a rise in intolerance. Prohibition is linked to just about everything in the 1920s. You don't have the boom in music if you don't have speakeasies, which are a result of prohibition. That's what the bottom left video here is, of pouring what is probably going to be rye whiskey down the drain so that nobody can drink it. Prohibition characterises the 1920s very much so, and it leads to, of course, gangsters like Al Capone here, the Chicago North Side gangster, who they are glamorized a lot, these gangsters, because it's all part and parcel of this cultural package of the 1920s, but we saw the effects that they had on each other and on people, getting gunned down in the street, massacres being committed. It's brazen, it's open, it's the police either can't or won't get much of a hold on it until they start to change some of the laws around how you make income tax. And that way in which they catch Al Capone, of course, you have to declare any income, even if the income itself is illegal. That's how they get it. You haven't declared your income because it was illegal income, therefore we're going to come and get you for income tax fraud, which is a clever way around it, but they have to invent laws in order to do that. So the gangsters characterise the 1920s very much so, and they are something that gets worse because of prohibition. Without prohibition, you don't have bootlegging, you don't have smuggling, you don't have stills that grow up in bathtubs and in the woods all over the country, and you definitely don't have the gangsters. Final point here of what gets worse is the Ku Klux Klan. Although the racism, the divisions date way back in the United States, you could argue that it's there from The Birth of the Nation. Indeed, that's the name of the film, of course, in 1915, The Birth of a Nation, that leads to a renaissance of the Ku Klux Klan. They are, if you remember back to the lesson, born out of the Civil War, out of the tension between the whites and the freed blacks in the South. They characterize the 1920s because they grow enormously. Millions of members of the Ku Klux Klan. And some of them very powerful. You have state representatives, so that's politicians within their state, but you also have governors, 2 or 3 governors are members of the KKK, and so those are the most important, kind of like the president of a state. So the Ku Klux Klan, they are evidence of the divisions in the 1920s becoming worse, but they're still the same divisions that we had before. And you can see in this picture here just how brazen they are. They march on Washington, members of the Ku Klux Klan, with their hoods up and carrying these huge banners. This one says America First, which has some echoes with today and some intended echoes with today. America First is a movement that grows into nationalism in the 1930s, in particular led by someone called Charles Lindbergh, who we haven't come across much, but I'll explain a bit more about him in a minute. So the Ku Klux Klan is certainly something that one would argue gets worse throughout the 1920s. But overall, to sum up the decade, some things get better, some things get worse, some things stay the same. What does that mean? How do we understand the 1920s? How do we sum it up in our minds? I've got a couple of different ideas here. There is no right answer here. It's up to you. What do you think of the 1920s? Is it a time of boom? Is it an exciting time? Is it a time where things stay the same? Is it a time where things get worse? Is it a time that you wouldn't want to go and live in for whatever reason? Is it a time that you would gladly jump at the opportunity to go and visit? A couple of different ways to think about it. You can think about it economically as a period of boom and bust, as a period of party and hangover, as a period of good times, and then the other side of the coin of the bad times, especially after 1929. You can think of it, socially speaking, as a time where it depends on who you are. For a lot of people, it's a time where their lives get a lot better. For a lot of people, it's a time where they experience a huge amount of division, and that division is becoming more and more obvious, and for unfortunately far too many people it is a time of great intolerance. And I don't mean that as in good intolerance, I mean that as in enormous intolerance, of segregation, where the colour of your skin defines your legal position and your social position, and to an extent your economic position, where you as a human being are defined by you as your colour of your skin. It's a time in terms of culture, and this is probably where, when you think of the 1920s, your mind will initially go. It's a time of boom for the culture, of not just in the United States, but around the world included. It's a period where the music that's been handed down from the 1920s, the art, the literature, the film, everything that I was just explaining a minute ago, it kind of sums up the boom and sums up the good times. You think of the 1920s and you think of jazz dancing and you think of flappers and you think of the Charleston and you think of the great literature. Culturally, it is certainly a boom time. But there are parts of the culture that aren't so good, as we just saw, like gangsters, like prohibition. So culturally, it's time of contradiction as well. Generally, the position that it plays in the cultural psyche in how do people think of the 1920s is it's a good time. A couple of different names here for it. The Roaring Twenties, as in this is the kind of the title of the whole course. The Jazz Age, because it's the age at which jazz music grew up and developed and became enormously popular, the dominant form of music at the time. In France, it's known as Les Années Folles, which means the mad years or the crazy years, because it's kind of just crazy good times. And in Germany, interestingly, it's known as the Golden Twenties or the Happy Twenties, because for the Germans in particular, of course, it represents a gap. And that's something that one can look at in the United States as well. Is the 1920s the norm, or is it an aberration, a difference, a caesura, a pause? Because if we look at it in a little bit more broader context, one could argue, and indeed this is a position taken by some historians today, not very many, but a few, so it's worth thinking about, that between 1914 and 1945, the whole world was characterized by just one big war. That you don't have the Second World War without the First World War, and in between, although there wasn't war in some nations were very much at war. If you stay on and do history next year, then you will see that early on in Germany, not exactly a war, but a lot of unrest and trouble. In Russia, there's a civil war that goes on into the 1920s. And then as you get into the 1930s, China's invaded by Japan, and that's kind of a war that characterizes a lot of the 1930s for those two nations. And Italy invades Ethiopia, or Abyssinia as it was, which is where Rastafarianism comes from. Haile Selassie, the emperor of Ethiopia, seen as fighting against the evil forces of the empires of Italy. And he's revered as a prophet by Rastafarianism. So if you listen to Bob Marley's music very closely, in fact, listen to War by Bob Marley, the song War, because that is a speech verbatim, word for word, given by Haile Selassie at the League of Nations, which Bob Marley says to music. So why am I talking about that? Because that's to do with the war that is happening throughout the 1930s. And even in Europe, there is war in Spain, the Spanish Civil War between the Republicans and the monarchists and Franco, the fascists. That's a war that in some ways, in many ways, really is a precursor to, if not an early start to, the Second World War. Some would argue that the Second World War begins with the Spanish Civil War. Not very many, but again, worth thinking about. And so all of that, one could argue that really the 1920s is not the norm, but is odd. It stands out because the 1910s is the First World War and the 1930s is the Great Depression. You've got war around the world, and the 1940s is, of course, the Second World War. And so what is the 1920s? Is it having a party whilst the Titanic is sinking? Or is it what human beings do and that war is the unusual bit? Difficult questions, interesting things to think about, because the 1920s isn't just kind of interesting anecdotes. It plays a role in the early history of the 20th century that's worth figuring out, because it ultimately gets back to what is human society built on. Is it built on the good times, or is it built on trying to get over the bad times? Anyway, the final thing I wanted to mention was a couple of book recommendations. The one on the right is one that I have, as I mentioned before, recommended at least once in every lesson. I'm sure, The Great Gatsby. It's not very long, but it is brilliant. It is the quintessential 1920s novel, and one could argue the quintessential American novel, the great American novel. It's all about the good times and the bad times, essentially, and that they work together as a relationship, that you can't have the good times without the bad times. It's about so much more than that. So do read it. It's not too tricky to approach, but it's as brilliant as its reputation would suggest. The other book on the left is a non-fiction book by an American author called Bill Bryson, who you might well have heard of. He wrote this history based on 1927 and based on a guy I mentioned earlier, Charles Lindbergh, who he was an aviator. He flew planes, and that's why you've got a little cartoon of his plane on the front cover, The Spirit of St. Louis. He is a very interesting character, Charles Lindbergh, very complicated man. He starts off as this great aviator, and there's kind of three reasons why he's interesting. One is because he is one of the early great plane flyers when air transport is just beginning to kind of find its feet, as it were. The second reason is because in about 1932-33, his son, Charles Jr., the Lindbergh baby, is kidnapped. And the FBI, who are just kind of forming as an investigative unit, get involved. And so right at the birth of the FBI, you have the biggest celebrity in the United States involved in this case. And I won't tell you what happens, but definitely go and look that up. And then the third reason why Lindbergh's interesting is because as you get later on into the 1930s, he leads a campaign, a nationalist campaign called America First. And this is a campaign that has links to the fascists of Europe, that is based on expanding the segregation and the racial divisions in the United States. So he is the big celebrity of the era, Lindbergh, and what Bill Bryson does is he keeps on coming back to Lindbergh and the aviation races, whilst looking at baseball and looking at music and looking at gangsters and looking at the United States based on 1927. Really interesting book, quite long, but what else are you going to do these days? So have a look at both of those, absolutely. But that's it for the course. If you've got any questions about any of these points, or about you want any more book recommendations or any information, or anything you want clearing up, then please do ask, because it's what I'm here for. Hopefully that all made sense. Hopefully that was elucidating. And if you want to get in touch, and you can see my email address is down there, WMRF. Okay, thank you very much for your attention, and I hope to see you all soon.